Well, good afternoon, and we're back in the times of the Depression. As you recall, last week we have described the sort of the various details of the Depression and how it affected almost all Americans. One thing to remember this week is that Roosevelt was elected in, of course, the second Tuesday of November of 1932, but he wasn't inaugurated until March of 1933. So the country had another almost 3 or 4 months to wait before action was taken. But that gave them some time to think about what they're going to do, and we're going to hear about that today from our speaker, no stranger to ILR, Richard MacMaster, emeritus history professor and just a general source of knowledge that he shares so willingly with all of us. And he will be talking to us today about how Roosevelt and the New Dealers put America back to work. Richard, please.
Can we get the pictures? Okay. There we are. Is that a familiar scene? Do you recognize what that is? It looks like January 6th, but it's actually July 1932. And that being the summer, Congress was out of session. If you could possibly get out of Washington in the summer, you did. So it's an empty building that the bonus army are swarming in front of. And the bonus was to be paid to veterans of the Great War, the World War One. And if you had, well, actually, it was on the basis of $1.25 for every day you were in service. And if you had served overseas, that could be a maximum of $650. And if you had only been stateside, that it was just 500. But both of those were pretty substantial sums of money in 1932. That bill actually was passed in 1924. The only problem with it was that they gave you a certificate that you could claim the money in 1945. And if you were out of work in 1932, it wasn't very much help. So the bonus people came to Washington. And we'll see more of them in a minute. What's going on here? Maybe you should do it. Why don't you do it? Nothing is happening. All right. So here we go, some statistics. In 1930, there were 4 million, roughly, Americans unemployed. In 1931, 6 million. In 1932, 12 million. That meant 1 in every 7 adults was without any kind of paid work. But other millions were underemployed, working only 2 or 3 days or just 1 week in a month. Part of that was to share jobs so that I wouldn't have to make a choice between you and fire you and keep you. I'd hold on to both of you. But that meant, of course, that you had a very, very limited income. So an awful lot of people are in desperate straits. In percentage wise, the unemployment rate in 2022 was 3.7. And we consider that, that's a little high, maybe. But in 1932, it was just a shade under 30%. So it's really a desperate situation for most people. And yeah. So farm income had fallen more than 50% from 1929 to 19, is that just 1930? I think it is. Yeah, it's just in that 1 year. 86, you could read this as well as I can because I'm blinking at it. 86,000 businesses had failed and closed their doors. And some of the major corporations had simply trimmed their operations. And in most cases, that meant a great number of jobs lost. Let me give you an example. In the small Virginia city of Fishersville, Augusta County in the Shenandoah Valley, uh, General Electric had a factory where they made stoves. And in 1930 or 31, they decided they would consolidate all of their manufacturing to Bridgeport, Connecticut, with the result that over 2,000 employees were out of work in a really small place. There was also a DuPont rayon factory there, and that did keep going. But the plant manager decided that he would go to some of his business friends in Stanton and the rest of that area, and they would put together a company to manufacture, in this case, certain types of furniture. And he talked the local banks into funding it. And the purpose of all this was to take all of these now unemployed workers that he knew because he'd been running the plant and give them back a job. But that did not happen very often. That was one of those sort of wonderful stories that somebody really made the effort. So all sorts of businesses are closing. The economy is shutting down. And this is what, I can't even read that. Does anybody know what that guy wanted? I can't quite read it. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was the average income, which was pretty small, that if you were going to be even reasonably comfortable, I mean, that is to say, you could actually go to the grocery store and buy the groceries, and if you were renting, you could pay the rent. You needed about 5,000, 6,000 a year, and the average uh, job was paying something like, well, roughly half that, 2,300, and it had dropped now to the average weekly income, or the average, I guess that's an annual income by 1930 was just about $1,600. And a huge number of people did not have, even when they were fully employed, a $3,000 income. So there's a great deal of poverty in the United States, even without all the awful effects of the Depression. So the Hoover administration did provide some relief. The federal money went to the states to build roads, to construct public buildings, and so on. In, if you'll pardon the Virginia references, in Stanton, they built a federal courthouse in 1930, and that employed quite a number of people, but it was mainly road work. And these work relief programs operated from September 1939 to April 1933. And then they were out of business, but they will be picked up, as we'll see. Now, with all of this, by 1932, we're now before the New Deal come in, with all this going on, the bonus army came to Washington. And these vast numbers of unemployed, mostly actually American veterans. And they're on their way to Washington to ask for the immediate payment of the bonus. And I should mention that my dad worked for a man in our community who ran successfully for Congress, bucking the national trend in 1932 solely on the issue of paying the bonus. That it was a very popular idea. And what happened? Well, you probably know all this anyway, but Hoover sent the army. And Dwight Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur had a pitched battle with these people who were all camped out on the mall and drove them out. And that was July 1932. A smaller bonus army returned in 1933, and Franklin Roosevelt sent his wife. FDR allocated, I have the wrong number there, it was actually 28,000 slots for veterans in what would be the Civilian Conservation Corps. And he not only sent his wife to talk to them on two full days, but he provided that they would all be put up. They didn't have to sleep in cardboard boxes on the mall. They could go to Camp Reed across the Potomac, where they would be housed in barracks and where they would be given 3 meals a day. So it was a very different response. However, Roosevelt was adamantly opposed to paying the bonus because of the effect on the US Treasury. So he had said in his inaugural address that our primary objective is to put people back to work. So the first thing that came through the Congress was the Civilian Conservation Corps. And this was to have young men, 18 to 25, unmarried, sign up and be sent to state and national parks and similar places to do work of all sorts, sometimes building roads, sometimes planting trees, sometimes clearing obstructions in streams, all sorts of things like that. And they built a lot of facilities in both national and state parks. They were operational in April, and the first workers arrived in May. And the very first camp was in Luray, Virginia, Page County, again in the Shenandoah Valley. And that was camp number one. But by June, just, a month later, there were almost 1,500 camps and 300,000 young men working in them. And 2 years later, 1935, there were 500,000 CC boys on 2,600 camps. So it was a huge operation in the early 30s and quite successful. You may have experience of some of what they did around in wherever your hometown was. They did a lot of good stuff. It was probably the most popular of all the New Deal programs. There wasn't very much you could do to criticize it. Now, once the Hoover program of work relief expired, the Congress immediately filled it in with another similar work relief program. And in this case, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, May 1933. And the point of all this work relief was twofold. Well, of course, the point was to put people back to work, period. But the perimeters of the program were you could not make anything that would compete with any private enterprise. Because what would be the point? If we were to set up a plant to make the kind of stoves that GE had made in Fishersville, well, we would be putting people out of work in Bridgeport, Connecticut, who were making those stoves there for GE. So that was part of it. But the other part of it was they could not compete on a wage scale. So if, let's say, there was an existing sewing factory in your community and they paid so much an hour or so much a day or week, you had to offer them under FERA less than that. So, for example, not quite a picture of that, but anyway, an example of that again, if I'm going back to the Shenandoah Valley, I lived there a very long time. In Stanton, they had a kind of sewing operation under FERA, and they made garments to be given to the Red Cross to be distributed free of charge to victims of flooding in the Mississippi at that point, and they were paid $7 a week, which was really pretty low pay. But again, if you were responsible for a family, you were glad to have $1 a day because that was more than nothing a day. And this is a 1-year continuation of the existing work relief program. Now, the next step is the Civil Rights Administration. Roosevelt really believed that this unemployment was going to be a short-term operation, that, the people would be going back to work. The economy is going to turn around. So by the autumn of 1933, we wouldn't need any kind of work relief program, certainly not a federal program. But as it looked like winter is coming on and unemployment was just as high, the Congress passed the Civil Works Administration. This was indeed a short term, another one of these uh, fall and spring operations to help people get through what would be a tough winter. This is a sewing factory. They're doing garments, and this is one under Farah. It's not the one in Stanton, but it's the same kind of operation. All right. Then Farah had an interesting sideline. I don't know if does anybody know about when Florida gave away Key West? The state of Florida gave it to the federal government. What happened was that with various kinds of work relief in at that point, quite poor community, Key West was absolutely bankrupt. They didn't have a penny. So, although it was probably unconstitutional, the good men and true in Tallahassee said, we're going to ask FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, to take control of Key West and turn it around. And they did, amazingly, because what they did, they had a very bright man, a local, he was a local Floridian in charge of it. And his idea was, you know, we've been surviving on fishing and mangoes and stuff like that. But this should be a tourist destination. Let's make every American want to come to Key West and see what it's like. You know, we'll have hotels and restaurants and all sorts of things. And that's what happened. So he turned under FERA, he turned Key West around. And at that point, Florida really wanted it back, so they got it back. No civil war over that one. All right, now the next one that came along in 1933, because now they begin to realize this unemployment isn't going to go away. This is the PWA, long-term infrastructure products proposed by the states and municipalities. It wasn't just some, excuse me, it wasn't just some federal agent coming in and saying, "Hey, don't you want a new park?" It was things that came from the communities themselves or from the states. And these public works were designed not by relief agents, but by engineers to make necessary municipal improvements and to build major highways. So, for example, it was finished in 1935, was a highway connecting Key West to the Florida mainland. The railroad that linked that had been knocked out by a hurricane. So now there was a road, and all these tourists could come down there. Among other PWA programs were the Grand Coulee Dam. In New York City, they built Lincoln Tunnel, the Triborough Bridge, LaGuardia Airport, all sorts of things all over the country. And I was looking for another photograph because in our local paper, they, I don't know that we particularly wanted it, but in our community, there had never been curbs. And the PWA built curbs. And there was a picture in the local paper of 2 or 3 little boys, about 4 or 5, of whom I was one, who are poking in the ditch full of water that was created by the PWA in front of our house. So that was my memory of PWA. They also, I never liked this, and this must have come later in the maybe very late 30s or early 40s. Uh, the PWA took a natural, we called it a lake, but it was just a very large pond in a park. And it was, I remember struggling around there on those double uh, bladed ice skates that little kids had. And it was all very nice. And they came in and they poured concrete all over everything. And so it looked like somebody's very large swimming pool. And I thought that was a great loss, but it kept people. So I suppose I shouldn't object. And now, now this is a really fascinating one. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was created in 1935. And for the first time, it separated relief and employment. Well, actually, it was employment for the unemployed, but it was no longer work relief. There was no question of relief. And they had a vast variety of programs. And I think you saw some of it this morning if you were here for Don McLaughlin's presentation. And we're going to look at just a touch of what the WPA did. And they also did some of this uh, landscaping parks and that kind of thing. All right, we had the Federal Arts Project. And this put people to work in the arts, in the physical painting and so on. Practically every post office that was around in those days got a mural. Some of them were very, very good. And some of them you wonder, was this somebody who had failed art in high school? but they're there. And that was one thing that was very visible all over the country with these paintings. And they also commissioned artists just to paint. And it's interesting that people who you would go to a major art museum like the Metropolitan in New York, and you would see paintings by Thomas Hart Benton or Grant Wood or I had his name on my an abstract artist. Who's an abstract artist of that time? Jackson Pollock. All right, they were all WPA people at one point. So you could be really a master of your craft and also be on the WPA payroll. And so it was a very interesting program, and it lasted down into about 1940, 41 on that. And I think you saw some of the Federal Theater Project, which covered all sorts of things that they produced plays. A lot of them were very almost political in their alignment. They were raising questions, like uh, it's well, there was one that was backed by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union that I can't now remember the name of it, Maybe somebody else remembers it. But there were a lot of experimental plays, but there were also putting on Shakespeare and Ibsen and all sorts of traditional plays. And yeah, we've got an example here with It Can't Happen Here, and as in the one corner, the other corner there with the skull is 1/3 of a nation, and the Caravan Theater in the middle, and the one in the upper right-hand corner is a Broadway theater that has a uh, WPA play that's playing there. The Adelphi in New York, Broadway, was particularly WPA backed. And then down in the lower corner, you'll see they were also supporting Yiddish theater, which probably, like Broadway, couldn't have survived without this kind of federal help. So it's again, it's a fascinating kind of operation. And then finally, there's the Federal Writers Project. And we may have another picture. I don't know if you recognize the lady in the upper left hand corner is Zora Neale Hurston, a great Florida writer. And in another picture, she is holding the Guide to Florida, the WPA Guide to Florida. One of their cornerstones was uh, the American Guide series. And if you ever pick those up, they're dated, terribly dated now, but they're wonderful in the way they cover every single little place in any state. So if you wanted to find out something about Bluffton, Ohio, it'll tell you more than you want to know. It's dated, yes, it's 80 years ago, and but it's a lot of history and so on. They were very good in those books in looking up landmarks, and by that meaning all the historic buildings in the area, and in some cases they measured them, and they tell you exactly how large they were and how many amenities and so on. And many of those buildings are gone, but many others, it was really the beginning, I would think. And Roy will know much better than I on this. I would really think it had something, at least it gave impetus to historic preservation in this country. And then all sorts of other things were subsidized by all sorts of writers. You didn't have to be a great novelist to get on the WPA payroll. Hey, here are some of the. Oh, I knew I had that picture. There's the WPA Guide to Florida, and in the picture in the lower right-hand corner, Zora Neale Hurston is holding the WPA Guide to Florida, in which she had had a role. And there's a guide to all of America right in the middle. But they were ones for states and cities. And it was a wonderful project. Now, one of the other things that the, excuse me, the WPA Writers Project did was to preserve historic documents. I used to have, and in a move, I donated it somewhere, a WPA transcript, like mimeographed, as everything was in those days, mimeographed, big, fat, 2 books of the 17th century uh, town records, the meeting of the town meeting and so on of the community I grew up in. And it was most interesting because the book, or one of the two books, had been used. The original 17th century books had been used by a local minister to record his sermons. So you had several Puritan sermons uh, in the hand of the rather obscure minister. Uh, and the WPA made that available. You could go to the local library, you go to the state library, and so on. And if you wanted to research that, you could find it right away. And they saved an awful lot of historical documents like that. It was a way of putting people to work. And this particular slide is an amazing project that was to interview people in 1935, 36, 37 who had been born in slavery. Now, obviously, they were very old, and many of them had been no more than children. I mean, in 1938, my grandmother was 80 years old, and she would have been born in 1858. So if she'd been born a slave, her memory could only have been of a couple of years in the 1860s when she was a very little girl. But there were some people who were older than that, and they were all interviewed all over the place. Teams of workers went out, some white, some black. And this is just an interesting sidelight. In Charleston, South Carolina, the interview team was made up of both white and black interviewers. And it so happens that a black man and a white woman interviewed the same elderly man. And someone noticed, because these things then were again published. I mean, you'll find them in the university library, all sorts of libraries. Then somebody noticed that when this man, who was old enough actually to have some memory, some real memory of slavery, when he was interviewed by the white woman, he talked about, you know, uh, our master he was really a good man. He took pretty good care of us, and his wife, oh yeah, she was good, and she, you know, at Christmas time she would give us this or that, you know. It was, oh, everybody was just wonderful. And when the black guy interviewed him, he said, "Yeah, uh, that old master of mine, he was a real, you know." And was he cruel? I was just young, but I saw him have somebody whipped for dropping a plate. You know, I mean, he was not a nice man at all, and his wife. So I always thought that was quite interesting. That because it's actually true of any kind of historical document. You know, depends on who is asking and who the person who's telling is, and how free they say, or what they expect you to want them to say. Anyway, it's just a little sidelight there. But that was, again, a wonderful project, because if you think about it, it only took maybe another 10 years, and you could never do it again. You could never talk to anybody who had actually been a slave. Is that the end? That's the end. Well, let me, before I come to the end, let me add just a couple of little bits here that despite all of these programs, unemployment remained high, that they went down steadily. If my memory is correct, they went down from about 30% in 32 down to 20 something in 33, about 21 in 34, about 18 in 35, about 14% in 36, and down to just about 10%, maybe a little shade under in 1937. Then for some reason, it shot up to 19% in 1938, and then it started going down again. And it was close to 12%, I think, in 1941 before the war. And then, of course, after 1942, not surprisingly, it was about 1%. So everybody will say, well, the war cured unemployment. And of course it did, but only because you were drafting vast numbers of people and so on. So by and large, I think the New Deal succeeded. And even if they failed in some ways on just bringing full employment, they did have an amazing number of things that really quite improved American life. That we had better roads and better electric power and all sorts of other things. And I just wish they hadn't poured all that concrete in our little lake. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Questions, Roy?
I think the Writers Project and talking about landmarks was important, but there was another program that was specifically designed to put architects to work called the Historic American Building Survey. And that continues to this day, and it's very, very important. And about a third of the buildings that were surveyed and documented during the early years have disappeared primarily due to fires. Sometimes it's been possible to restore those properties because the documents are there in Washington in the survey. Locally, those of you who know the Devil's Mill Hopper may be surprised to learn that it was a CCC project. I've been doing some research on it in connection with the talk I'm giving next month on the New Deal programs and the Florida state parks, because the first 7 Florida state parks were either CCC or WPA projects. But I was surprised in researching this to learn that the Devil's Mill Hopper was. And I think there clearly was fraud involved. The property had been owned by the Dell family here for about 50 years, and they ran tours out to the Devil's Mill Hopper by horse and buggy from their livery stable downtown. In 1935, the Dell sold it to the J.C.'s to turn it into a recreational facility for the Gainesville area. Within about 2 weeks, the J.C.'s transferred it to Alachua County, and in turn, Alachua County applied for and got federal money under the CCC program. As you pointed out, those monies were not available to individuals. It had to be state, um, federal, or local governments. So Alachua County got the money, built those steps down to the bottom of the mill hopper that was still here when I came in '62. And as soon as they had gotten the money and done the work, the county transferred it back to the JCs. So there's a lot of local history that is responsive to the New Deal as well.
We have Rick Gold on Zoom, if you'd like to unmute.
Okay, thanks so much. Could you talk a bit about the constitutionality of some of these programs and how that was addressed?
Well, I'm sorry. That's next week. That practically all of the not the CCC, but a number of New Deal programs were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court starting in 1935. So the NRA, the National Recovery Act that covered a lot of these things, was completely thrown out and by the Supreme Court. And so we'll look at some of that, but and a number of things. For example, Florida giving Key West to the federal government was almost certainly unconstitutional, but it worked, and they took it back. So
Would you speak a little bit about the rural electrification programs, how that all spawned?
ooh, this may be above my pay grade here. I'm not sure. This rural electrification was a very, very important issue in the 30s because it had been in the 20s also, because it meant bringing rural America into all the innovations of these years. I mean, you could have all sorts of things, including electric light, if you had these things. So you had TVA was a major New Deal program that provided by creating dams all over East Tennessee and I don't know where else. But
Well, all over the place.
what?
I think it was all over the place, all over the South.
Yeah.
Right,
but
South electricity.
But they got and their headquarters was at Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and they provided electricity to people all over the place. And although it's this is just a silly anecdote, but I'm full of such things. I just wanted to share. A friend of mine said that when electricity came to the rural part of Virginia that they lived in, that her grandmother had the house, or maybe her father did it for her grandmother. The house was set up with electricity, but the grandmother never dared turn it on because it would bring some terrible problem. The house would burn down. So the house was totally electrified, but they depended on candles and kerosene lamps and whatnot. But it was I agree with you, it was a great, important thing for American life. Very much as a lot of the highway construction opened up a possibility to people who were really quite isolated, that now you could actually drive to town. You could bring your crops to market much more easily. So
Paul, did you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I've got a quick comment or two. Thank you, Richard, to bringing back memories of that period with some good hard facts about how terrible it was and how much and how broad the effort was to regenerate American culture as well as its economy. I think we have to recognize that there were some awful opposition to it. They cute accusations of communism and so forth. But what I remember, one thing I remember was our newspaper at home on Long Island in New York was a local newspaper and very conservative. And they had cartoons, which I understood the cartoon figure, I think his name was Willie, was always in every cartoon, there was a picture somehow of some guy looking kind of unsavory, leaning on a shovel. And these were with something that indicated that WPA in progress. And the guy was half asleep and he wasn't working. And it was really a terrible shot at making people who were in severe trouble and doing some of the things like the WPA to get work and to be productive and making fun of them. The other memory I have was in the 60s. I don't know how many of you at the University of Florida remember Dick Johnson. He was the registrar for a long, long time, and Dick and I were friends. I was working at Stetson in those days. And one time we had to get from Miami to Key West, which you've already alluded to. And we were riding in a car down the highway. And he said, I want to stop here. And he got out and he started just looking around. And he said, I had to stop here because this is such a strong memory of mine. There was a hurricane that came through. When he said I was I was a CCA, and I was working with crews down there, and with other workers, and the hurricane just swept across the Keys, and many hundreds, or at least there were hundreds, I believe, of the CCA workers drowned in that hurricane in the 1930s, and Dick had been there and had experienced that. One other comment about big projects like the TVA and others, I think the other one that affected the South particularly was the fact that the land and much of the eastern part of the South in the eastern states had worn out because of cotton. And they had huge projects to refertilize and regenerate agriculture in the southern states through modern agricultural scientific techniques. And another one of those things that happened in that period that got cut off, and one has to stop and wonder, I certainly still do, that if that hadn't been cut off at the knees, what America would be like today, and the way we would have looked at how incredibly progressive and how incredibly productive this country could have been. We had to go fight a war.
Any other? Yes.
You talked a lot about civilian projects. Weren't there also a lot of projects involving the military, shipbuilding, improvements of military bases?
Oh, yeah. I think so.
She's wondering, were there projects involved in building and improving military bases in the 30s, perhaps anticipating war?
Oh, I'm sure there were, because obviously the federal government would have no problem allocating people or funds to improve some of those. Like, it's it again. It's above my pay grade here. I don't know the answer. Oh, Roy may know.
Just one thing I'd say about the CCC, I think it's well agreed that the discipline and just the organization of the workers in those times really formed a lot of the backbone of the American Army and going into World War II. Those men knew discipline, they knew order, and a lot of them ended up the NCOs and who really
Interesting.
it strengthened our military effort without a doubt.
Well, I was just going to say that the CCC was operated by the U.S. Army,
Yes, Yes.
and there were U.S.
Oh.
Army officers in charge of each camp. So yes, that was very much part of our unintended preparation for World War II.
One thing I do remember, you mentioned Thomas Hart Benton. I went to a college at Iowa State, and there are some just fantastic murals in the library. And I just never connected that they were probably all done in the 30s as part of that arts program. Yes. Yes.
The Maine Post Office in Bangor, Maine has a mural on the wall. It's a huge mural, extremely well done, and it's there to this day.
yeah.
Well, folks, thank you very much, and thank you, Richard. We'll see you again next week,
Yes.
and we'll carry the story from there. Thanks again. See you next week.